the decline in religious observance among young people is very closely related to some other very prevalent youth trends, particularly unemployment and the very demanding educational system that they have here. And so young people are feeling really tied up in these challenges of getting educated and getting the right credentials and then trying to get a good job. And they just don't feel like they have room in their lives for religion.
Subscribe with iTunes, Audio Boom, Stitcher, or your favorite podcasting app. And if you enjoy what you hear, like us on Facebook. Also, consider throwing a little cash our way by visiting patreon.com/KoreaFM. And find more of our great content on our home on the web, KoreaFM.net. While living in South Korea and not religious myself, I've taken several opportunities that were available to me to attend church services and speak with religious South Koreans in order to try to better understand the religion here and also to compare it with the religion I was inundated with as a child growing up in rural Iowa. And while my general findings have been that the religious South Koreans I've met and spoken with are much more devout and attend church much more often than the people I grew up with in Iowa, data seems to show another side of religion here in the ROK. Seoul-based reporter Stephen Borowick recently wrote an article for Al Jazeera English titled "Why Young South Koreans Are Turning Away from Religion." And Stephen joins me now to discuss the personal stories and data from that piece. So, Stephen, great to have you on the program again. As I mentioned, I've had a somewhat different view of religion here in South Korea than the title of your article would suggest. But after living in the ROK for several years, I immediately understood and agreed with the points that you made, and it seems that the viewpoints are not mutually exclusive. So you began this piece by introducing a South Korean who goes to church a lot less often than she did while growing up. Let's begin with a little bit of her story.
Well, she told me that she had been raised in an Anglican family and regular church attendance was an important part of her family's routine. But as she became an adult, as she grew older and she took on the challenges of working full time and particularly having children, she now has 2 children that are, I don't remember their exact ages, but they're elementary school age. And she just felt in trying to handle the myriad responsibilities of leading a household, she no longer had time to attend church, and she only attended church on sort of major holidays. I met her on Easter Sunday at an Anglican cathedral in Seoul. And so she described religious observance as something that, she was still maybe important to her sentimentally, but in her day-to-day life, she didn't really have much time for. And I led the article with her because I felt like her story kind of encapsulated the bigger themes that I was getting at.
And was it hard to find a South Korean who would go on the record with you about somewhat growing out of their faith or not, having enough time, as you just pointed out, or was that not so hard?
Well, I was fortunate. I mean, I got a good introduction from one of the people quoted in my story, a reverend named Junok Hyun. He's one of the main reverends at the Seoul Anglican Cathedral. And he's in charge of programs for young people. So I interviewed him first, and then I asked if I could come back to the church during a service and speak to some of the congregants. And so he facilitated that for me. So it wasn't that difficult, actually.
Moving on to the churches themselves, you wrote that, quote, "In many South Korean cities, there are more churches than convenience stores." This is something I immediately noticed when I first came to South Korea. A lot of the churches have glowing crosses, so at night they really stick out. And you also went on to write that 20% of South Koreans identify as Protestant, the largest group in the country, followed by 15% as Buddhists and nearly 8% as Catholics. Now, that seems low compared to a country like my own of the United States, but considering the history of South Korea and the location, that's somewhat significant for this area of the world, correct?
Yeah, I think South Korea is the second most Christian country in Asia after the Philippines. And if you look at those 2 countries, the higher levels of Christian observance are attributable to the presence of missionaries over the years. So in South Korea and North Korea, for that matter, there's a long history of missionaries coming over from the U.S. And one of the professors that I interviewed for this story told me that what he attributes that to, what he attributes higher levels of Western religion in Korea compared to China or Japan or other countries, was that around the time that the missionaries started showing up, there was not a strong indigenous religion that to resist the missionaries. So there weren't really prevalent local religious beliefs that the local population was very closely wedded to. So they were more susceptible to taking on new ideas and accepting the religious teachings of the missionaries.
And so despite this enormous increase in Christianity since, the Western world began sending these missionaries to the Korean Peninsula, basically you're pointing out that that's not so much the case over the last decade or so, correct?
Well, there's been, if you look really closely at the data, the number of people identifying as religious in South Korea is pretty stable. So, but what my article was about mostly was about young people, and the data show that there is a fairly pronounced decrease in the number of young people who identify as religious. So it's a very nuanced picture. And in my article, I was mostly trying to talk about what's going on with youth. And because I think that the decline in religious observance among young people is very closely related to some other very prevalent youth trends, particularly unemployment and the very demanding educational system that they have here. And so young people are feeling really tied up in these challenges of getting educated and getting the right credentials and then trying to get a good job. And they just don't feel like they have room in their lives for religion. So, like I said, the overall picture of religious observance here in South Korea is not one of absolute decline, but there is a noticeable trend of decline, particularly among young people.
And so due to that decline, you mentioned some ways that churches are trying to either hold on to their young members or perhaps even attract new ones. What methods did you find church uses to try to accomplish those tasks?
Well, it seemed to me that what the churches were going for was trying to create a somewhat less hierarchical and less judgmental setting. So Reverend Ju, who I spoke to, he told me that he's in charge of programs for young people at the church. And when he deals directly with young people, he told me he tries to deal with them in a very non-judgmental manner and not tell them what they're doing wrong or what they're doing right in their lives, but just to provide consolation and provide emotional support. And he's also organized these events that take place not in the church, take place at sort of neutral sites like coffee shops, where they hold events where young people can come and discuss either theological matters if they want, or social issues, or they can talk about personal matters. So the churches are trying to, I think, burnish an image for themselves as not just a place of religious worship and of religious instruction, but a place where people can come for emotional support, social support, and the church can function as a kind of social infrastructure for people to get support and fulfillment in their lives. In part because a lot of these young people are dealing with this really difficult job search and a really tough economy.
And so, of course, given that unemployment rates for Koreans in their 20s or so are the highest they've pretty much ever been, and that, technology, of course, is king in South Korea, do you think churches are going to be successful in these attempts to keep their young members? Or perhaps do you think it's more likely young Koreans will continue, as you put it, to turn away from religion?
Well, I mean, I'm not really one to make predictions. This is a big and evolving scenario, so I can't really be sure how it's going to play out. But I think it'll probably, the nearer term trends will probably depend on the economy. As unemployment becomes worse and as this long, like I mentioned in the piece, just how long Koreans, I think it's 111 days the average person spends looking for a job. As long as those challenges remain as prevalent and as unforgiving as ever, I think young Koreans will probably continue to worship less and participate less in religious activities. But over the long term, there are also cases where in societies, as unemployment increases and as the economy struggles, sometimes people turn more to religion as a source.
Yeah, sometimes the church is the answer.
Well, sometimes people look to churches for support and for meaning. I think we're coming to a point in human history where, due to the rise of technology and several other things, fewer and fewer people are going to have jobs. And so we're going to have to find a way of getting our identities and getting the meaning in our lives from something other than what we do for a living, which is the way that we've done it for a very long time. So, I mean, who knows? Over the next, in the mid to long-term future, we might see a kind of resurgence of religion. Who knows?
And then Stephen Borowicz, Soul-Based Reporter, thank you for speaking with me. Final thoughts, anything else you want to add before we say goodbye?
I enjoyed writing and reporting that story, and thank you for taking an interest in it and having me on the chat.
Absolutely, of course. I've been speaking with Stephen Borowicz, a Soul-Based Reporter. You can check out this article in Al Jazeera English titled "Why Young South Koreans Are Turning Away from Religion." Stephen, great speaking with you.
Thanks, Chance.
This episode is brought to you by Podcast Assist, offering voiceovers, audio editing and mastering, transcriptions and show notes, episode summaries, and even hosting a podcast on a topic important to you. Visit Facebook.com/Podcast Assist for more info on their flat $30 per hour rate. Talk radio, music, and podcasts from the Korean Peninsula. KoreaFM.net.